This is Audible. Audio Renaissance presents The Psychology of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden, read by the author.
Hello. In his quest to understand the universe in which he lives, man is confronted with three fundamental facts of nature: the existence of matter, of life, and of consciousness. In response to the first of these phenomena, he developed the sciences of physics and chemistry. In response to the second, he developed the science of biology. In response to the third, he developed the science of psychology. It is notorious that, to date, the greatest advances in knowledge have been achieved in the field of physics, the least in the field of psychology. As a being who possesses the power of self-consciousness, the power of contemplating his own life and activity, man experiences a profound need for a conceptual frame of reference from which to view himself. He has a need for a self-intelligibility, which it is the task of psychology to provide. This program is offered as a step toward the achievement of that goal. Before we proceed any further, I should like to clarify that, in this program, the word man does indeed include both men and women. I use the word man simply to increase this audiobook's ease of listening. The more inclusive person, or he/she, tends to lend an awkwardness to the spoken word. So then, the central theme of this tape is the role of self-esteem in man's life. The need of self-esteem, the nature of that need, the conditions of its fulfillment, and the consequences of its frustration. We'll also explore the impact of a man's self-esteem, or lack of it, on his values, responses, and goals. Virtually all psychologists recognize that man experiences a need of self-esteem. But what they have not identified is the nature of self-esteem, the reasons why man needs it, and the conditions he must satisfy if he is to achieve it. Virtually all psychologists recognize, if only vaguely, that there is some relationship between the degree of a man's self-esteem and the degree of his mental health, but they have not identified the nature of that relationship nor the causes of it. Virtually all psychologists recognize, if only dimly, that there is some relationship between the nature and degree of a man's self-esteem and his motivation, that is, his behavior in the spheres of work, love, and human relationships, but they have not explained why, nor identified the principles involved. Such are the issues with which this program deals. Writing in the early years of the 20th century, the German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus made an observation that has become famous. Quote, "Psychology has a long past, but only a short history." Unquote. His statement was intended to acknowledge the fact that, throughout recorded history, men have been intensely concerned with issues and problems of a psychological nature, but that psychology as a distinct scientific discipline emerged only in the second half of the 19th century. Up to that time, the domain of psychology had not been isolated as such and studied systematically. It existed only as a part of philosophy, medicine, and theology. What is the science of psychology? How is it to be defined? What is its specific domain? Psychology is the science that studies the attributes and characteristics which certain living organisms possess by virtue of being conscious. Consciousness is used here in its widest and most general sense, to indicate the faculty and state of awareness, of any form of awareness. This range includes the complex mode of cognition possible to man, to the far more limited range of awareness possible to a frog. The more complex and highly developed the nervous system of a given species, the greater is the range of its consciousness. Man's is the most highly developed nervous system, and his is the widest range of awareness. The chimpanzee's is less, the cat's still less, the frogs still less. While psychology is concerned with all conscious organisms, it is primarily concerned with the study of man. Man's defining attribute, which distinguishes him from all other living species, is his ability to reason. This means to extend the range of his awareness beyond the perceptual concretes immediately confronting him, to abstract, to integrate, to grasp principles, to apprehend reality on the conceptual level of consciousness. An animal's range is only as wide as its percepts. The rudimentary forms of inference of which it may be capable are entirely dependent on the physical cues within its immediate sensory field, in the context of past experience. It cannot conceptualize, it cannot initiate a process of question-asking, it cannot project a chain of inference that is independent of immediate sensory stimuli. But man can chart on the back of an envelope the motion of planets through the outer reaches of space. Like every other species that possesses awareness, man survives by the guidance of his distinctive form of consciousness, by the guidance of his conceptual faculty. This is the first fact about man's nature that must be understood. This is the starting point of any scientific study of man, the basic principle without which no aspect of the distinctively human can be understood. Whether one is seeking to understand the nature of emotion, or the psychology of family relationships, or the causes of mental illness, or the meaning of love, one must begin by identifying the fact upon which any subsequent analysis of man necessarily rests. That is, that man is a rational being, a being whose distinctive form of consciousness is conceptual. Thus psychology, as it pertains to man, is properly conceived and defined as the science that studies the attributes and characteristics which man possesses by virtue of his rational faculty. From the simplest unicellular animal to man, the most complex of organisms, all living entities possess a characteristic structure, the component parts of which function in such a way as to preserve the integrity of that structure, thereby maintaining the life of the organism. When an organism ceases to perform the actions necessary to maintain its structural integrity, it dies. For all living entities, action is a necessity of survival. Life is motion, a process of self-sustaining action that an organism must carry on constantly in order to remain in existence. Biologically, inactivity is death. The action that an organism must perform is both internal, as in the process of metabolism, and external, as in the process of seeking food. An organism maintains itself by exercising its capacities in order to satisfy its needs. An organism's needs are those things which the organism by its nature requires for its life and well-being. An organism's capacities are its inherent potentialities for action. When a physical or psychological need fails to be fulfilled, the result is danger to the organism. However, needs differ in the degree of their urgency, and in the form of the threat which they potentially pose. This is most easily seen in the case of physical needs, but the principle applies to all needs. Man has a need of oxygen and of food, but whereas he can survive for days without food, he can survive for only minutes without oxygen. Man can survive much longer without vitamin C than without water, but both are needs. In some cases, the frustration of a need results in immediate death. In other cases, the process can take years. And need frustration does not have to result in the organism's destruction directly. Instead, it can undermine the organism's overall capacity to live and thus make the organism vulnerable to destruction from many different sources. This principle is important to remember in considering the frustration of psychological needs. A desire or a wish is not the equivalent of a need. The fact that a great many men may desire a thing does not prove that it represents a need inherent in human nature. Needs must be objectively demonstrable. While the task of isolating and identifying man's physical needs is far from completed, biology has made enormous advances in this direction. With regard to the task of isolating and identifying man's mental needs, psychology is in a state of chaos. This chaos serves, however, to emphasize the fact that the nature of men's needs has to be discovered. Needs are not self-evident. Alleged needs must be proven by relating them to the requirements of man's survival. That man possesses psychological needs is indisputable. The widespread phenomenon of mental illness is evidence both of the existence of needs which are being thwarted and of the failure of psychology to understand the nature of these needs. The basic problem of motivational psychology may be formulated this way. It is to bridge the gap between needs and goals, to trace the steps from the former to the latter, to understand the connection between them, to understand how needs get translated into goals. It should be obvious that the solution of this problem requires a consideration of man's distinctive capacities. Yet in large measure the history of motivational psychology represents an attempt to bypass man's most distinctively human capacity, his conceptual faculty, and to account for his behavior without reference to the fact that man can reason, or that his mind is his basic means of survival. The projection of man as a conscious automaton activated by instincts is one version of this attempt. Instinct is a concept intended to bridge the gap between needs and goals, bypassing man's cognitive ability. As such, it represents one of the most disastrous and sterile attempts to deal with the problem of motivation. Observing certain types of behavior which they believe to be characteristic of the human species, instinct theorists decided that the causes of such behavior are innate, unchosen, and unlearned tendencies which drive man to act as he does. Thus, they spoke of a survival instinct, a parental instinct, an acquisitive instinct, and so forth. They seldom attempted to define precisely what they understood an instinct to be. Still less did they trouble to explain how it functioned. They vied with one another in compiling lists of the instincts their particular theory assumed man to possess, promising to account thereby for the ultimate sources of all human action. To account for man's actions in terms of undefinable instincts is to contribute nothing to human knowledge. It is only to confess that one does not know why man acts as he does. To observe that men engage in sexual activities and to conclude that man has a sex instinct, to observe that men seek food when they are hungry and to conclude that man has a hunger instinct, to observe that some men act destructively and to conclude that man has a destructive instinct, is to explain nothing. It is merely to place oneself in the same category as the physician in the anecdote who supposedly explains to a distraught mother that the reason why her child will not drink milk is that your child is just not a milk drinker. Man is born with needs, but he is not born with a knowledge of those needs and of how to satisfy them. Some of his simpler body maintenance needs are satisfied automatically, given the appropriate physical environment, by the function of his internal organs. An example is the need for oxygen, which is satisfied by the automatic function of his respiratory system. But the broad range of his more complex needs are not satisfied automatically. Man does not obtain food, shelter, or clothing by instinct. To grow food, to build a shelter, to weave cloth, requires consciousness, choice, discrimination, judgment. Man's body does not have the power to pursue such goals of its own volition. It does not have the power purposefully to rearrange the elements of nature, to reshape matter, independent of its consciousness, knowledge, and values. Unsatisfied, unfulfilled needs can set up a state of tension or disquietude or pain in man. This can prompt him to seek biologically appropriate actions, such as protecting himself against the elements. But the necessity of learning what is the appropriate action cannot be bypassed. Man's body only provides him with signals of pain or pleasure, but it does not tell him their causes. It does not tell him how to alleviate one or achieve the other. That must be learned by his mind. Man must discover the actions his life requires. It was not an instinct that enabled man to make fire, to build bridges, to perform surgery, to design a telescope. It was his ability to think. And if a man chooses not to think, if he chooses to risk his life in senseless dangers, to close his eyes rather than open his mind at the sight of any problem, if he chooses to seek escape from the responsibility of reason in alcohol or drugs, or to act in willfully stubborn defiance of his own objective self-interest, he has no instinct that will force his mind to function. He has no instinct that will compel him to value his life sufficiently to do the thinking and perform the actions which his life requires. To define man as a rational animal is not to imply that he is an animal who invariably functions rationally. Obviously, he is not. Rather, it is to identify the fact that his fundamental distinguishing characteristic, the attribute that essentially differentiates him from other animals, is his ability to reason, to apprehend reality on the conceptual level of consciousness. One of the most important consequences of man's possession of a conceptual faculty is his power of self-awareness. No other animal is capable of monitoring and reflecting on its own mental operations, of critically evaluating its own mental activity. No other animal is capable of deciding that a given process of mental activity is irrational or illogical, and of altering its subsequent mental operations accordingly. But the same conceptual faculty that confers on man a unique stature compels him to confront unique challenges. No other animal is explicitly aware of the issue of life or death that confronts all organisms. No other animal is aware of its own mortality, or has the power to extend its longevity through the acquisition of knowledge. No other animal has the ability and the responsibility to weigh its actions in terms of the long-range consequences for its own life. No other animal has the ability and the responsibility to continually work at extending its knowledge, thereby raising the level of its existence. No other animal faces such questions as, who am I? How should I seek to live? By what principles should I be guided in my actions? What goals ought I to pursue? What is to be the meaning of my life? The necessity of confronting such issues is essential to the human condition, to everything that is distinctive about man's life. All of man's unique achievements and all of his potential problems are consequences of his possession of the conceptual form of awareness. The relation of man's reason to his survival is the first of two basic principles of man's nature which are indispensable to an understanding of his psychology and behavior. The second is that the exercise of his rational faculty, unlike an animal's use of his senses, is not automatic. The decision to think is not biologically programmed in man. To think is an act of choice. This principle was first formulated by novelist-philosopher Ayn Rand this way, quote, "The key to human nature is the fact that man is a being of volitional consciousness. Reason does not work automatically. Thinking is not a mechanical process. The connections of logic are not made by instinct. The function of your stomach, lungs, or heart is automatic. The function of your mind is not. In any hour and issue of your life, you are free to think or to evade that effort. But you are not free to escape from your nature, from the fact that reason is your means of survival. So that for you, who are a human being, the question to be or not to be is the question to think or not to think." Unquote. In the brain of a normal human being, sensations are automatically integrated into perceptions. That is, they are wired into the nervous system. This is not true of the conceptual level of consciousness. Conceptual awareness is necessary to man's proper survival, but it is not implanted by nature. Man has to select that purpose. He has to direct his mental effort and integrate his mental activity to the goal of conceptual awareness by choice. To engage in an active process of thinking, to abstract, conceptualize, relate, infer, to reason, man must focus his mind. He must set it to the task of active integration. The choice to focus in any given situation is made by choosing to make awareness one's goal, awareness of that which is relevant in the given context. The goal of awareness is set by giving oneself, in effect, the order, "grasp this." That this goal is not wired into man's brain by nature scarcely needs to be argued. One does not need to design special laboratory experiments in order to demonstrate that thinking is not an automatic process, that man's mind does not automatically pump conceptual knowledge when and as his life requires it, as his heart pumps blood. The mere fact of being confronted with physical objects and events will not force man to abstract their common properties, to integrate his abstractions, or to apply his knowledge to each new particular he encounters. Man's capacity to default on the responsibility of thinking is too easily observable. He must choose to focus his mind. He must choose to aim at understanding. A man is in focus when and to the extent that his mind is set to the goal of awareness, clarity, intelligibility, with regard to the object of his concern. To sustain that focus with regard to a specific issue or problem is to think. To let one's mind drift in will-less passivity, directed only by random impressions, emotions, or associations, or to consider an issue without genuinely seeking to understand it, or to engage in an action without a concern to know what one is doing, this is to be out of focus. What is involved here is not an issue of the degree of a man's intelligence or knowledge, nor is it an issue of the productiveness or success of any particular thinking process, nor is it an issue of the specific subject matter with which the mind may be occupied. Rather, it is an issue of the basic regulating principle that directs the mind's activity. Is the mind controlled by the goal of awareness, or by something else, by wishes, fears, or the pull of lethargic passivity? There are different levels of awareness possible to man's mind, determined by the degree of his focus. The choice to focus or to think does not consist of moving from a state of literal unconsciousness to a state of consciousness. This clearly would be impossible. When one is asleep, one cannot suddenly choose to start thinking. So, to focus is to move from a lower level of awareness to a higher level, to move from relative mental passivity to purposeful mental activity. In the state of passive awareness, a man can apprehend the need to be in full mental focus. His choice is to evade that knowledge or to exert the effort of raising the level of his awareness. The decision to focus and to think, once made, does not continue to direct a man's mind unceasingly thereafter, with no further effort required. Just as the state of full consciousness must be initiated volitionally, so it must be maintained volitionally. This point can hardly be overemphasized. The choice to think must be reaffirmed in the face of every new issue and problem. The decision to be in focus yesterday will not compel a man to be in focus today. The decision to be in focus about one question will not compel a man to be in focus about another. In any specific thinking process, man must continue to monitor and regulate his own mental activity. In any hour of his life, he is free to suspend the function of his consciousness, to abandon effort, to let his mind drift passively. He is free to maintain only a partial focus, grasping that which comes easily to his understanding, and declining to struggle for that which does not. Man is free not only to evade the effort of purposeful awareness in general, but to evade specific lines of thought that he finds disconcerting or painful. Perceiving qualities in his friends or himself that clash with his moral standards, he can surrender his mind to blankness or switch it hastily to some other concern, refusing to identify the meaning or implications of what he has perceived. Grasping that he is pursuing a course of action that is in blatant defiance of reason, he can plunge his mind into fog and continue on his way. In such cases, a man is doing more than defaulting on the responsibility of making awareness his goal. He is actively seeking unawareness as his goal, and this is the meaning of evasion. In the choice to focus or not to focus, to think or not to think, to activate the conceptual level of his consciousness or to suspend it, and in this choice alone is man psychologically free. As focusing involves expanding the range of one's awareness, so evasion consists of the reverse process, of shrinking the range of one's awareness. Evasion consists of refusing to raise the level of one's awareness when one knows that one should, or of lowering the level of one's awareness when one knows that one shouldn't. To evade a fact is to attempt to make it unreal to oneself, on the implicit premise that if one does not perceive the fact, it does not really exist, or its existence will not matter and will not entail any consequences. Man's life and well-being depend upon his maintaining a proper cognitive contact with reality, and this requires a full mental focus, maintained as a way of life, as a way of being. To be in focus does not mean that one must be engaged in the task of problem-solving every moment of one's waking existence. It means that one must know what one's mind is doing. The more consistently and conscientiously a man maintains a policy of being in full mental focus, of thinking, of judging the facts of reality that confront him, of knowing what he is doing and why, the easier and more seemingly natural the process becomes. The steadily increasing knowledge he acquires as a result of his policy, the growing sense of control over his existence, the growing self-confidence, all serve to put every emotional incentive on the side of his continuing to think. Further, they reduce the possibility of an incentive that could tempt him to evade. It is too clear to him that reality is not, and can never be, his enemy, that he has nothing to gain from self-inflicted blindness, and everything to lose. This does not mean that for such a man the policy of rationality becomes automatic. It will always remain volitional, but he has programmed himself to have every emotional incentive for rationality and none for irrationality. To borrow a phrase from Aristotle, he has learned to make rationality second nature to him. That is the psychological reward he earns for himself. But, and this must be emphasized, his psychological state must be maintained volitionally. He retains the power to betray it. In each new issue he encounters, he still must choose to think. This is the meaning of his free will. Free will, in the widest meaning of the term, is the doctrine that man is capable of performing actions which are not determined by forces outside his control, that man is capable of making choices which are not necessitated by antecedent factors. Man's free will consists of a single basic choice, to focus or not to focus, to think or not to think. This basic choice controls all of man's other choices and directs the course of his actions. His mind is an organ over which man has a specific, delimited, regulatory control. The driver of an automobile can steer the car in a chosen direction, but cannot alter or infringe the mechanical laws by which the car functions. In the same way, man can choose to focus, to aim his cognitive faculty in a given direction, but cannot alter or infringe the psychological laws by which his mind functions. If a man does not steer his car properly, he has no choice about the fact that he will end in a smash-up. Neither has the man who does not steer his mind properly. A man is free to think or not to think, but he is not free to escape the fact that if he fails to think, if he characteristically evades facing any facts or issues which he finds unpleasant, he will set in motion a complex chain of destructive psychological consequences. One of these will be a profound loss of self-esteem. This is a matter of demonstrable psychological law. Or again, if a man forms certain values as a result of his thinking or non-thinking, these values will lead him to experience certain emotions in certain situations. He will not be able to command these emotions out of existence by will. If he recognizes that a specific emotion is inappropriate, he can alter it by rethinking the value or values that evoke it. But he can do so only in a specific manner, not by arbitrary whim. Free will does not mean arbitrary, omnipotent power, unlimited power over the workings of one's own mind. This must be understood. Thus, to the extent that one understands the principles by which man's mind operates, one can predict the psychological consequences of given ideas, values, conclusions, attitudes, and thinking policies. One can predict, for example, that a man of authentic self-esteem will find intellectual stagnation intolerable, that a man who regards sex, life, and himself as evil will not be attracted to a woman of intelligence, independence, and guiltless self-confidence, that a man whose guiding policy is, "Don't antagonize anyone," will not be the first to champion a radical new idea or theory. I have stressed that man's ability to reason is his essential attribute, the attribute which explains the greatest number of his other characteristics. This fact is often obscured by the widespread confusion about the nature and role of emotions in man's life. One frequently hears the statement, "Man is not merely a rational being, he is also an emotional being." This implies some sort of dichotomy, as if man possessed a dual nature with one part in opposition to the other. In fact, in the ultimate sense, not in the obvious sense, but in the ultimate sense, the content of man's emotions is the product of his rational faculty. His emotions are a derivative and a consequence which cannot be understood without reference to the conceptual power of his consciousness. As man's tool of survival, reason has two basic functions: cognition and evaluation. The process of cognition consists of discovering what things are, of identifying their nature, their attributes, and properties. The process of evaluation consists of man discovering the relationship of things to himself, of identifying what is beneficial to him and what is harmful, what should be sought and what should be avoided. Quoting Ayn Rand in her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, "A value is that which one acts to gain and or keep," unquote. It is that which one regards as conducive to one's welfare. A value is the object of an action. Since man must act in order to live, and since reality confronts him with many possible goals, many alternative courses of action, he cannot escape the necessity of selecting values and making value judgments. If a man regards a thing as good for him in some way, he values it, and when possible and appropriate, he seeks to acquire, retain, and use or enjoy it. If a man regards a thing as bad for him in some way, he disvalues it, and seeks to avoid or destroy it. If he regards a thing as of no significance to him, as neither beneficial nor harmful, he is indifferent to it, and takes no action in regard to it. Although his life and well-being depend on man's selecting values that are, in fact, good for him, that is, consonant with his nature and needs, there are no internal or external forces compelling him to do so. He is not biologically programmed to make the right value choices automatically. He may select values that are incompatible with his needs and inimical to his well-being, values that lead him to suffering and destruction. But whether his values are life-serving or life-negating, it is a man's values that direct his actions. Values constitute man's basic motivational tie to reality. A man's values are the product of the thinking he has done or has failed to do. Values can be a manifestation of rationality and mental health, or of irrationality and neurosis. They can grow out of self-confidence and benevolence, or out of self-doubt and fear. They can be motivated by the desire to achieve happiness, or by the desire to minimize pain. They can be born out of the desire to use one's mind, or the desire to escape it. They can be held consciously and explicitly, or subconsciously and implicitly. They can be consistent, or they can be contradictory. They can further a man's life, or they can endanger it. These are the alternatives possible to a being of volitional consciousness. Differences in men's basic values reflect differences in their basic premises, in their fundamental views of themselves, of other men, of existence. Differences in their views of what is possible to them and what they can expect of life. A man's view of himself plays a crucial role in his value choices. For example, a man regards a falling bomb as bad for him because he is aware of his own mortality. If he were physically indestructible, he would appraise the bomb's significance differently. One's conscious or subconscious view of one's own person, whether one appraises oneself correctly or not, is implicit in one's value judgments. The degree of a man's self-confidence or lack of it, and the extent to which he regards the universe as open or closed to his understanding and action, these will necessarily affect the goals he will set for himself, the range of his ambition, his choice of friends, the kind of art he will enjoy, and so on. For the most part, the process by which a man's view of himself affects his value choices does not take place on a conscious level. It is implicit in his evaluations, reflecting earlier conclusions which in effect are filed in his subconscious. The subconscious is the sum of mental contents and processes that are outside of or below awareness. The subconscious operates as a storehouse of past knowledge, observations, and conclusions. It operates, in effect, as an electronic computer, performing super-rapid integrations of sensory and ideational material. Thus, his past knowledge, provided it has been properly assimilated, can be instantly available to man, while his conscious mind is free to deal with the new. This is the pattern of all human learning. Once a man needed his full mental attention to learn to walk. Then the knowledge became automatized, and he was free to pursue new skills. Once a man needed his full mental attention to learn to speak. Then the knowledge became automatized, and he was enabled to go forward to higher levels of accomplishment. Man moves from knowledge to more advanced knowledge, automatizing his discoveries as he proceeds. He turns his brain into an ever more efficacious instrument, if and to the extent that he continues the growth process. A man acquires values and disvalues. These too become automatized. He is not obliged in every situation he encounters to recall all of his values to his conscious mind in order to form an estimate. Example: if an experienced motorist perceives an oncoming truck veering toward a collision, he does not need a new act of conscious reasoning in order to grasp the fact of danger. Faster than any thought could take shape in words, he registers the significance of what he perceives, his foot flies to the brake, or his hands swiftly turn the wheel. One of the forms in which these lightning-like appraisals present themselves to man's conscious mind is via his emotions. So next, let's talk about emotions. His emotional capacity is man's automatic barometer of what is for him or against him within the context of his knowledge and values. The relationship of value judgments to emotions is that of cause to effect. An emotion is a value response. It is the automatic psychological result of a super-rapid subconscious appraisal. The sequence of psychological events is from perception to evaluation to emotional response. On the level of immediate awareness, however, the sequence is from perception to emotion. A person may or may not be consciously aware of the intervening value judgment. A separate act of focused awareness may be required to grasp it because of the extreme rapidity of the sequence. That a person may fail to identify either the judgment or the factors involved in it, that he may be conscious only of the perception and of his emotional response, is the fact which makes possible man's confusion about the nature and source of emotions. Emotions are not tools of cognition. To treat them as such is to put one's life and well-being in danger. What one feels in regard to any fact or issue is irrelevant to the question of whether one's judgment is true or false. It is not by means of one's emotions that one apprehends reality. The mere perception of an object has no power to create an emotion in man, let alone to determine the content of the emotion. The emotional response to an object is inexplicable, except in terms of the value significance of the object to the perceiver, and this necessarily implies a process of appraisal. For example, 3 men may look at a scoundrel. The first man recognizes to what extent this person has betrayed his status as a human being and feels contempt. The second man wonders how he can be safe in a world where such persons can prosper and feels fear. The third man secretly envies the scoundrel's success and feels a sneaking admiration. Note that all 3 men perceive the same object. The differences in their emotional reactions proceed from differences in their evaluation of the significance of what they perceive. Just as emotions are not created by objects of perception as such, so they are not the product of any sort of innate ideas. Having no innate knowledge of what is true or false, man can have no innate knowledge of what is good for him or evil. A man's values are a product of the quantity and quality of his thinking. The motivational power and function of emotions is evident in the fact that every emotion contains an inherent action tendency, that is, an impetus to perform some action related to the particular emotion. Love, for example, is a man's emotional response to that which he values highly. It entails the action tendency to achieve some form of contact with the loved person, to interact intellectually, emotionally, physically. The emotion of fear is a man's response to that which threatens his values. It entails the action tendency to avoid or flee from the feared object. The action involved is not always physical. For example, there are feelings of quiet happiness that invoke in man the desire only to remain still and contemplate the source of his happiness, or the beauty of the world around him. But every emotion carries some implication for action. This does not mean that the action should necessarily be taken. It may not be possible or appropriate in a given context. We don't have to act on a feeling just because we have it. The action implication of some emotions is negative. That is, they tend specifically to retard or inhibit action. This is evident in the case of acute depression. The person feels that nothing is worth doing, that action is futile, that he is helpless to achieve happiness. The impulse is toward stillness, passivity, withdrawal. Whether a man's emotional mechanism brings him happiness or suffering depends on its programming. It depends on the validity and consistency of his values. His emotional apparatus is a machine. Man is its driver. According to the values he selects, he makes the motivational power of his emotions work in the service of his life or against it. Reason and emotion are not antagonists. What may seem like a struggle between them is only a struggle between two opposing ideas, one of which is not conscious, and manifests itself only in the form of a feeling. The resolution of such conflicts is not always simple. It depends on the complexity of the issues involved. But resolutions are achievable, and the necessary first step is to recognize the actual nature of that which needs to be resolved. The guiltless emotional spontaneity that men long for, the freedom from torturing self-doubts, enervating depression, and paralyzing fears, is a proper and achievable goal. But it is possible only on the basis of a rational view of emotions and of their relation to thought. It is possible only if one's emotions are not a mystery, only if one does not have to fear that they may lead one to destruction. It is the reward of a person who has assumed the responsibility of identifying and validating the values that underlie his emotions. The person for whom emotional freedom and openness do not mean the suspension of awareness. The single most formidable obstacle to identifying the roots of one's emotions is repression. Repression is a subconscious mental process that forbids certain ideas, memories, identifications, and evaluations to enter conscious awareness. Repression is an automatized avoidance reaction whereby a man's focal awareness is involuntarily pulled away from any forbidden material emerging from less conscious levels of his mind or from his subconscious. Among the various factors that may cause a person to feel alienated from his own emotions, repression is the most formidable and devastating. But it is not emotions as such that are repressed. An emotion cannot be repressed. If it is not felt, it is not an emotion. Repression is always directed at thoughts. A man can repress the knowledge of what emotion he is experiencing, or he can repress the knowledge of its extent and intensity, or he can repress the knowledge of who or what aroused it, or he can repress the reasons of his emotional response, or he can repress conceptual awareness that he is experiencing any particular emotion at all. He can tell himself that he feels nothing. Repression differs from evasion in that evasion is instigated consciously and volitionally. Repression is subconscious and involuntary. In repression, certain thoughts are blocked and inhibited from reaching conscious awareness. They are not ejected from focal awareness, they are prevented from entering it. In order to understand the mechanism of repression, there are three facts pertaining to man's mind that one must consider. 1. All awareness is necessarily selective. In any particular moment there is far more in the world around him than a man could possibly focus on. Thus, he must choose to aim his attention in a given direction to the exclusion of others. 2. There are degrees of awareness. There is a gradient of diminishing mental clarity along the continuum from focal awareness to peripheral awareness to total unawareness or unconsciousness. 3. Man is a self-programmer. To an extent immeasurably greater than any other living species, he has the ability to retain, integrate, and automatize knowledge. As a man develops, the quantity of programmed data in his brain grows immeasurably, expanding the range and efficacy of his mind. Cognitions, evaluations, physical skills, all are programmed and automatized in the course of normal human development. It is this programming, retained on the subconscious level, that makes possible man's continued intellectual growth. It also makes possible the instantaneous cognitive, emotional, and physical reactions without which he could not survive. When a man's mind is in active focus, the goal or purpose he has set determines what material will be fed to him from the subconscious. If, for instance, a man is thinking about a problem in physics, then it is the material relevant to that particular problem that will normally flow into his conscious mind. The subconscious is regulated not only by the orders it receives in any immediate moment, but by the standing orders it has received. That is, by a man's long-term interests, values, and concerns. These affect how material is retained and classified, under which conditions it is reactivated, and what kind of subconscious connections are formed in response to new stimuli or data. Repression entails an automatized, standing order forbidding integration. The simplest type of repression is the blocking from conscious awareness of painful or frightening memories. In this case, some event that was painful or frightening when it occurred and would be painful or frightening if recalled is inhibited from entering conscious awareness. Memory, like awareness, is necessarily selective. One normally remembers that to which one attaches importance. But in cases of repression, memories do not simply fade away. They are actively blocked. Consider the following example. A 12-year-old boy succumbs to the temptation to steal money from a friend's locker in school. Afterward, the boy is fearful that he will be found out. He feels humiliated and guilty. Time passes, and his act is not discovered. But whenever the memory of his theft comes back to him, he re-experiences the painful humiliation and guilt. He strives to banish the memory. He hastily turns his attention elsewhere, telling himself in effect, "I don't want to remember. I wish it would go away and leave me alone." And after a while, it does. He no longer has to eject the memory from conscious awareness. It is inhibited from entering. It is repressed. The act of banishing the memory has become automatized. Should the memory ever begin to float toward the surface of awareness, it is blocked before it can reach him. A kind of psychological alarm signal is set off, and the memory is again submerged. 20 years later, he may encounter the friend from whom he stole the money and greet him cheerfully. He remembers nothing of his crime. Or he may feel vaguely uncomfortable in his friend's presence, but with no idea of the reason. Thoughts and evaluations, like memories, may be barred from awareness because of the pain they would invoke. Consider the case of a neurotically dependent woman who is married to a cruel, tyrannical man. She dares not let any criticism of him enter her awareness because she has surrendered her life to him. The thought that her owner and master is irrational and malevolent would be terrifying to her. She observes his behavior, her mind kept carefully empty, her judgment suspended. She has automatized a standing order forbidding evaluation. Somewhere within her is the knowledge of how she would judge her husband's behavior if it were exhibited by any other man. But this knowledge is not allowed to be integrated with the behavior she is observing in her husband. She has programmed herself, in effect, to be blind. If a man is to avoid repression, he must be prepared to face any thought and any emotion, and consider them rationally, secure in the conviction that he will not act without knowing what he is doing or why. Ignorance is not bliss, not in any area of man's life, and certainly not with regard to the contents of his own mind. Repressed material does not cease to exist. It is merely driven underground to affect a man in ways he does not know, causing reactions he is helpless to account for, and sometimes exploding into neurotic symptoms. Now, there are occasions in a man's life when it is necessary for him to suppress thoughts and feelings. But suppression and repression are different processes. Suppression is a conscious, deliberate, non-evasive expelling of certain thoughts or feelings from focal awareness in order to turn one's attention elsewhere. Suppression does not involve a denial of any facts or a pretense that they do not exist. It involves the implicit premise that one will focus on the suppressed material later, when appropriate. Sometimes, undeniably, there is a danger in suppression. A man may suppress thoughts or feelings when there are still unresolved conflicts involved that require further attention and analysis. He may do so with no intent of dishonesty, but a suppression that is repeated consistently can turn into repression. In effect, the suppression becomes automatized. When a person represses, his intention is to gain an increased sense of control over his life. Invariably, inevitably, he achieves the opposite. Facts cannot be wiped out by self-made blindness. The person who attempts it merely succeeds in sabotaging his own consciousness. Repression devastates more than amends emotions. It has disastrous effects on the clarity and efficiency of his thinking. When a man tries to consider any problem in an area touched by his repression, he finds that his mind tends to be unwieldy and his thinking distorted. His mind is straitjacketed. It is not free to consider all possibly relevant facts. As a consequence, he feels helpless to arrive at conclusions, or the conclusions he reaches are unreliable. This does not mean that once a man has repressed certain thoughts or feelings, he is permanently incapacitated. With sustained effort, it is possible for him to de-repress. The details of the process of de-repression are outside the scope of this discussion. It must be noted, however, that the process can be extremely challenging. In order to avoid repression, or in order to de-repress, it is imperative that a man adopt a policy of becoming aware of his emotions, of paying attention to his emotions, that he take note of and conceptualize his emotional reactions, and that he identify their reasons. If his emotions are to be a source of pleasure to man, not a source of pain, he must learn to think about them, pay attention to them, be aware of them, bring his consciousness to bear on them. Rational awareness is